When the silence spoke louder than words, it was a quiet evening in Los Angeles, the kind of evening when the world slowed down just enough for thoughts to catch up with the heart. Sandra Bullock sat on the balcony of her home, the golden light of sunset spilling gently over the hills. Her phone buzzed beside her, lighting up with a message from a name that carried 1,000 memories. It was Keanu Reeves. For a moment, she hesitated to open it. She had just wrapped a long day of filming, her mind cluttered with dialogue, makeup, and the faint ache of pretending to be someone else. But Keanu's name had that strange power to calm the noise inside her. She unlocked the phone and read his words. Just checking in. How are you holding up? It was so typically him, short, simple, yet full of quiet care. She smiled, leaning back in her chair, remembering all the times he had reached out just like this. Not when it was convenient, not when it made him look good, but when he sensed, somehow, that she needed someone to ask. Sandra typed back slowly. Doing fine. Just tired. How about you? He replied within seconds. I'm around. Thought I'd drive by tomorrow if that's okay. She paused. Keanu rarely said if that's okay when he made plans. He was always respectful, but lately there was a gentleness in his tone that made her wonder if something was different. She didn't want to overthink it, but her heart felt a small flutter of warmth. The next day, the city woke up to soft rain, the kind that didn't chase people indoors but gave everything a silvery glow. Sandra made coffee and tried to tidy up her living room, pretending she wasn't waiting. But when she heard a knock at the door, her pulse quickened in a way she hadn't expected. Keanu stood there, soaked from the rain, wearing a simple black hoodie and jeans. He smiled softly, that same smile she remembered from decades ago when they first met on the set of Speed. It hadn't changed, not really. Maybe a few lines around the eyes, a few strands of silver in his hair, but the warmth behind it was exactly the same. You're dripping, she said, half laughing. It's just water, he replied, shrugging, stepping inside with that quiet calm that always made her space feel safer. He handed her a small paper bag. Inside was her favorite pastry from a cafe downtown, a place he somehow remembered she loved, even though she hadn't mentioned it in years. You remembered? She asked, genuinely surprised. Some things don't fade, he said simply. They sat together in the living room, the rain whispering against the windows. For a while, they didn't talk much. Keanu just looked around, noticing the photos on her shelves, her parents, her son, moments from film sets long past. His gaze stopped at one photo of the two of them from years ago, laughing behind the scenes, completely unaware that someone had captured it. He picked it up and smiled faintly. That was the day the bus broke down, he said, his voice warm with nostalgia. She laughed. And you were trying to fix it like you were an actual mechanic. I wanted to help, he said softly, his tone almost reflective. I always wanted to help. Sandra noticed the way his expression shifted when he said that. There was something behind his eyes, an exhaustion she hadn't seen before. Keanu was known for being private, for keeping his pain buried under calm smiles and gentle jokes. But she knew that look. It was the look of someone holding too much inside. You've been quiet lately, she said gently. He nodded, taking a deep breath. Yeah, just thinking a lot. About what really matters. She didn't push him. She knew better than to force words out of him. But the silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of unspoken understanding, built over years of mutual respect and care. Sometimes silence was the truest form of connection they had. After a while, Keanu stood up and walked to the window. You ever feel like time moves faster when you're not ready for it? He asked quietly. She looked up, surprised by the question. Every day, she admitted. I keep thinking about people I didn't thank enough, he continued. Moments I didn't hold on to. Sandra set her coffee down and joined him by the window. The city stretched below them, lights beginning to flicker on in the misty twilight. She glanced at him, his reflection faint in the glass, his eyes distant but kind. You've done more for people than you know, she said. Not always, he murmured. Sometimes I disappear when I shouldn't. Her heart ached at that. Keanu had always been selfless, often giving to others while forgetting himself. She wanted to tell him how much his kindness had meant to her over the years, how his quiet loyalty had carried her through some of her loneliest times. But the words caught in her throat. Instead, she simply said, "You've always been there when it mattered." He turned to her then, and for a brief second, the air between them felt heavy with everything they had never said out loud. Gratitude, affection, maybe even something deeper that neither dared to name. "I just didn't want you to think. I'd forgotten," he said softly. "I never thought that," she whispered. They ended up watching an old movie that night, not one of theirs, just something playing on TV. Keanu stretched out on the couch, his head resting back, eyes half closed. Sandra watched him, realizing how peaceful he looked when he finally let himself relax. She wondered how many people in his life got to see him like this. Unguarded, calm, real. Halfway through the film, he suddenly said, "Do you ever feel like you're living two lives? The one the world sees, and the one that's yours alone?" She looked at him, surprised again by his honesty. "Every actor feels that way," she said. "Yeah," he nodded. "But I think you've managed to stay yourself through it all. That's rare." His voice was sincere, and she could tell he meant it. She smiled softly. "Maybe because I had good people around me," she said, her eyes meeting his. "People who reminded me who I was." He smiled back. "I'm glad." Later that night, after he left, Sandra stood by the window again, watching his car disappear into the rain. Her heart felt heavier than before, but also strangely full. There was something in his tone, in the way he looked at her before leaving, that lingered long after he was gone. She picked up the photo he had touched earlier and stared at it for a long time. That day on set, all those years ago, they were just two young actors laughing between takes. But maybe even then, something unspoken had begun between them, something that never really faded. As she placed the photo back on the shelf, her phone buzzed again. A new message from Keanu appeared on the screen. "Thanks for tonight. I needed that," she typed back. "Me too." But before she could hit send, another message arrived. "There's something I need to tell you. Soon." Sandra froze, staring at the screen. The rain outside grew heavier, blurring the city lights into streaks of gold and gray. A quiet unease crept into her chest. She didn't know what he meant, but she knew this wasn't just about nostalgia anymore. Whatever Keanu needed to tell her, it would change everything. And for the first time in years, Sandra Bullock felt afraid of what tomorrow might bring, the secret behind his silence. The next morning, the rain had stopped, leaving behind a sky washed clean and pale. Sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of Sandra's room, landing softly on her face as she stirred awake. Her phone was still on the bedside table, the message from Keanu glowing faintly on the screen. "There's something I need to tell you. Soon." She read it again and again, her heart tightening a little more each time. What did he mean? Was something wrong? Or was it about them? About feelings neither had dared to voice for years. The thought made her uneasy. Keanu was not someone who spoke lightly. If he said he needed to tell her something, it meant he had been holding it inside for a long time. She got out of bed, made coffee, and tried to go about her morning as usual. But everything felt off. Every sound, every silence carried a strange tension, like the quiet before a storm. She thought about calling him, then stopped herself. Keanu valued space. If he said soon, she'd have to wait for him to be ready. Still, waiting had never been easy. By late afternoon, she decided to go for a drive to clear her head. Los Angeles shimmered in the distance, its usual noise muffled by the calm after the rain. She turned on the radio, but the songs only reminded her of the past, of scenes, laughter, long hours on sets, and quiet moments that lingered long after the cameras stopped rolling. As she drove past a familiar street, she suddenly noticed a small motorcycle parked outside a coffee shop. It looked old but well kept. She slowed down, heart skipping a beat. It was Keanu's. He always preferred simple things, never the flashy cars people expected from a movie star. She parked nearby and stepped inside the cafe. And there he was, sitting by the window with a notebook in front of him, his head slightly bent, lost in thought. His presence was calm. But there was something different about his eyes, like he was carrying a weight that didn't belong to him. When he looked up and saw her, A faint smile crossed his face. "Hey," he said, surprised but not startled. "Didn't expect to see you here. I was driving by," she said, trying to sound casual. "Guess the city's smaller than we think." He nodded, motioning for her to sit. "Coffee?" "Always," she replied. They sat together, steam rising from the cups between them. For a while, they just talked about small things, movies, mutual friends, random memories. But Sandra could tell he was avoiding something. His smile didn't quite reach his eyes. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. Finally, she leaned forward. "Keanu, what did you mean by your message?" He looked down, tracing the rim of his cup with his thumb. His silence stretched long enough that she started to regret asking. But then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I've been keeping something to myself. For a while." Her chest tightened. "What kind of something?" He took a deep breath, eyes fixed on the window. "A few months ago, I got a call. From an old friend. It wasn't about work, it was personal." Sandra's heart thudded. His tone had shifted, softer now, but heavy. "What happened?" He hesitated, then looked at her directly. "My sister's illness came back," she froze. She had known about his sister's battle years ago, how deeply it had affected him. She thought it had been behind them, that he'd finally found peace after all those dark years. "Oh, God, Keanu," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I thought she was better." "She was," he said. "But sometimes things return even when you do everything right." He smiled faintly, but there was no light in it. "I didn't want to tell anyone. Not the press, not the people I work with. I just wanted her to have some quiet time. But it's been harder this time. She's tired. And so am I." Sandra's eyes filled with tears. She tried to blink away. She reached across the table, placing her hand gently over his. "You shouldn't carry that alone." "I don't want pity," he said softly. "And I don't want to make it about me. I just needed someone who'd understand the silence." His words broke her heart. She squeezed his hand, holding it firmly. "You've always been there for everyone, Keanu. Let someone be there for you." He looked up at her then, and for a brief second his composure cracked. She saw the fear behind his calm, the exhaustion beneath the gentleness. It was the raw human side of him few ever saw. "I don't know how to do that," he admitted quietly. "I don't know how to let people in without feeling like I'm burdening them." "You're not a burden," she said. "You're someone who gives, and givers need to rest too." For the first time in hours, he smiled genuinely. "You always say the right thing." "Not always," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I try when it comes to you." They talked for hours that day, long after the cafe had emptied. He told her about visiting his sister, about the quiet moments in the hospital when he would just sit beside her, holding her hand, saying nothing. He spoke about how those silences had started to mirror his own life, moments of stillness, filled with words he never said. And as he spoke, Sandra realized something she hadn't before. For all his strength, Keanu lived with a kind of pain that had no outlet. He had built his life around kindness and humility, but in doing so, he had learned to hide his own suffering. When they finally stepped outside, the sun was setting again, painting the sky in soft orange and blue. Sandra looked at him and said, "You don't have to face this alone." "Not anymore." He looked back at her with quiet gratitude. "Having you here helps more than you know." They walked together to her car, and for a while neither spoke. The air was cool, the city calm. When they reached her car, he stopped and said, "There's another reason I wanted to tell you." She turned, curious. "What is it?" He hesitated, eyes dark with thought. "Because I might have to leave for a while. Not disappear, just step away from everything. To be with her. To make sure she's okay." Sandra nodded slowly, her throat tight. "Then you should. Nothing's more important than that." He smiled. That same gentle smile that always made her feel safe. "I was hoping you'd say that." But then his expression changed, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. "Still," he said softly, "there's one more thing I haven't told you." "Something that's been on my mind for years." Her breath caught. "What is it?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at her with a depth that made her heart pound. His voice lowered, almost a whisper. I'll tell you next time we meet, he said. But it's something that started long before either of us realized it. Before she could ask, he stepped back, smiled faintly, and walked toward his bike. She stood there watching as he put on his helmet and rode off, the sound fading into the distance. Sandra stayed there for a long time, the wind brushing through her hair, her heart full of questions and unspoken feelings. She didn't know it yet. But the next time they met, everything between them would begin to change forever. The day the laughter returned, days passed, then weeks. Sandra tried to focus on her projects, interviews, and daily routines, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Keanu. Every time she opened her phone, she found herself waiting for a message from him. Sometimes it came, sometimes it didn't. When it did, it was always brief but comforting. "She's resting today," or "just finished reading to her." She smiled. Those few words told Sandra more than he ever said aloud. She wanted to be there for him, but she didn't want to intrude. Keanu's world was built on quiet spaces, places where people didn't demand, didn't crowd. He had learned to survive by balancing on that thin line between closeness and solitude. Still, something in her heart told her that maybe, this time, he shouldn't face everything alone. One Friday morning, she texted him first. "Are you in the city?" After a few minutes, the reply came. "Yeah, for a day or two. She's stable." Her fingers hovered above the screen. Then she typed, "Come over for dinner." "Nothing fancy, just pasta and bad jokes." He didn't answer for a while, and she wondered if she'd said too much. But then the screen lit up. "Pasta and bad jokes? That's exactly what I need." That evening, she cooked while the sun disappeared behind the hills. She played soft music, lit a few candles, and kept glancing at the clock. When the doorbell finally rang, her heart skipped like it always did when he was near. Keanu stood there with a small smile and a bottle of red wine. "Hope this goes with your bad jokes," he said. "Depends," she replied, taking it from him. "Are you planning to tell any?" "No," he said with mock seriousness. "I prefer to laugh at yours." They both laughed. Real laughter, not the polite kind that fills interviews or red carpets. It was warm, easy, familiar. As they ate, the conversation flowed like it used to. He told her about the nurses at the clinic, about how one of them had accidentally mistaken him for a patient because of how tired he looked. She told him about her last filming day, how the director had insisted she redo a crying scene. 12 times until she actually started laughing halfway through. "You always manage to find humor in the hard stuff," he said. "I think it's survival," she replied, twirling her fork. "If you don't laugh, you drown." He nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah, I get that." There was a pause then, soft but heavy. She looked at him across the table and saw a man both broken and healing, fragile but grounded. The candlelight flickered in his eyes, and for a moment, neither spoke. The silence felt full, of gratitude, of years, of something neither dared name. After dinner, they moved to the living room. She brought out an old board game they used to play on set years ago during breaks. He looked at it and laughed. "I can't believe you still have this." "I keep everything that makes me laugh," she said, smiling. They played, teasing each other over silly moves, laughing until they forgot about everything else. It was the first time she had seen him truly laugh in months. When he laughed, it wasn't loud. It was soft, almost shy, but it filled the room in a way that made her heart ache. At one point, he leaned back and said, "I missed this." "What?" she asked. "This. The normal stuff. Talking, laughing, just existing without needing to perform." "You're still the same, Keanu," she said quietly. He shook his head. "I don't think I am. But that's okay. Maybe we're not supposed to stay the same." His words lingered in the air, tender and true. Sandra wanted to say something back, but before she could, his phone buzzed on the table. He looked at it and his expression changed instantly. "It's the hospital," he said, his voice tightening. She froze, watching as he answered. His tone turned calm, almost too calm, the kind of calm people use when they're trying not to fall apart. He listened, nodding a few times, then said softly, "I'll be there soon." When he hung up, she asked, "Is she okay?" He hesitated, his eyes distant. "They said her condition's unstable again." She stood up immediately. "Then you should go." He nodded slowly, but he didn't move. Instead, he looked at her, the pain in his eyes raw and unguarded. "I hate that this keeps happening. Every time things feel normal, it's like life reminds me that peace is temporary." She walked closer, her voice calm but steady. "Peace isn't gone. It just waits. It'll come back again." He looked at her, and for a second, the heaviness in his face softened. "How do you always know what to say?" "I don't," she said. "I just say what I wish someone would tell me." He exhaled slowly, then reached out, placing his hand lightly on her shoulder. "Thank you. For this. For tonight. I don't think I could have handled that call alone." Her heart tightened as she looked at him. "You don't have to." He gave a small, tired smile, then whispered, "I'll call you tomorrow." "You better," she said softly. As he turned to leave, she felt the air grow still. Something deep in her chest told her this moment mattered more than she understood. That night, Sandra couldn't sleep. The laughter from earlier replayed in her mind, overlapping with the sound of his quiet goodbye. She kept thinking about how fragile everything was, how quickly life could turn from laughter to fear, from warmth to cold. She checked her phone more times than she wanted to admit. No new messages, just the silence. By morning, she finally dozed off on the couch, only to be woken by a faint buzz. Her heart jumped. It was a message from Keanu. "She's stable again. The doctors say it's not over, but she's fighting." Sandra smiled faintly through the exhaustion. "So are you," she replied, but just as she was about to put her phone down, another message arrived. "There's something else, Sandra. Something about that night at the cafe. I didn't tell you the full truth." Her pulse quickened. She sat up, reading it again. "What do you mean?" she typed. This time, the reply took longer. "I'll explain when I see you. But it's about us, and why I kept my distance all these years." She froze, the words sinking deep into her chest. About us. As she stared at the message, the world outside seemed to fall silent. Sunlight poured through the window, but she barely noticed. Something was shifting. Something that had been waiting for years to be said. And in that moment, she knew the next time she saw Keanu, nothing would ever be the same again. What he never said, it had been 3 days since that message, and every hour seemed to stretch longer than the last. Sandra tried to keep busy. Meetings, interviews, quiet dinners with friends, but her thoughts kept circling back to those few words. "It's about us." She didn't know what to expect or what about us even meant. Maybe it was something simple, maybe not. Maybe it was something she had always felt but never wanted to confront. By the 4th day, she gave up pretending not to care. She texted him, "When can we talk?" The reply came hours later, just as the sun began to fade. "Tonight. Can I come by?" She stared at the message, her heartbeat rising. "Of course," she typed back. The sky turned violet as evening settled in. Sandra paced the living room, straightening things that didn't need straightening. Her home was quiet, except for the ticking clock on the wall. Every second sounded heavier than usual. When the knock came, she took a deep breath before opening the door. Keanu stood there wearing a dark jacket, his hair damp as if he'd just walked through light rain. His face was calm, but his eyes carried something deeper, something uncertain. "Hey," she said softly. "Hey," he replied, his voice low. They stood in silence for a few moments before she gestured him in. He stepped inside, removing his jacket and placing it carefully on the chair like he was trying not to disturb the air around him. "Coffee?" she asked automatically. "Yeah, sure," he said. In the kitchen, she tried to steady her hands as she poured the coffee. Her mind ran through possibilities. What he might say, what he might not. Part of her wanted to run from it. Another part wanted to finally know. When she returned, he was standing by the window again, the same spot he had stood in that night weeks ago when he said time moved faster than he wanted it to. "You always find that spot," she said gently. "It's quiet here," he said. "It feels honest." She handed him the coffee. "Then be honest," she said quietly. "What is it you wanted to tell me?" He took a deep breath, then turned to face her fully. "Remember the first film we did together?" She smiled faintly. "Of course. Speed." "Yeah. Everyone saw the chemistry, the jokes, the way we laughed between takes. But there was something else that started then. Something I didn't understand." She looked at him, her heart thudding. "What do you mean?" He exhaled slowly. I started feeling something real for you. Back then. And I didn't know what to do with it. I thought it was just the project, the energy, the connection actors feel on set. But even after the movie ended, it didn't go away." Sandra froze. Her breath caught in her throat. He continued before she could speak. "You were building your life, your career. I didn't want to cross that line. You deserved peace, and I didn't want to be the one to disturb it. So I stepped back. I told myself it was better that way. Safer." "And all these years?" she asked softly. "I tried to forget," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "But every time we crossed paths, on another project, an interview, even just a call, it came back, every time." The room fell silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Sandra stared at him, her emotions swirling between surprise, disbelief, and something that felt like relief. "Why tell me now?" she whispered. "Because," he said, stepping closer, "lately, with everything happening, my sister, the hospitals, the quiet nights, it made me realize how fragile everything is, how easily time slips away. I kept thinking, what if I never said it? What if you never knew?" His voice cracked slightly, the honesty raw and unguarded. Sandra's eyes filled, her chest tightening. She took a step closer. "Keanu, you don't have to—" He shook his head gently. "I know. I don't expect anything. I just needed you to know the truth. Because every time you showed up for me, every time you asked how I was doing, I wanted to tell you why it mattered so much. It wasn't just friendship. It never really was." She swallowed hard. "You think I didn't feel it too?" His eyes widened slightly. She looked down, then back at him. "I did. But like you, I thought it was safer not to say it. We were always surrounded by people, cameras, stories that didn't belong to us. I didn't want to ruin what we already had, and maybe I was afraid that if I admitted it, I'd lose one of the few people I truly trusted." Keanu's lips parted slightly, his expression softening. "So you did feel it?" "For a long time," she said, "but life moved in its own way. Different paths, different people. And yet somehow, it always came back to you." The words hung in the air, quiet but heavy. For a long moment, they stood there. Two people who had shared decades of friendship. Distance and silent understanding, now standing face to face with what had always been between them. Then Keanu looked away, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's more." Sandra frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, his hands tightening around the coffee cup. "The reason I've been quieter lately isn't only my sister's illness. There's something else. I didn't want to bring it up until I was sure." Her stomach dropped. "What is it?" He hesitated for several seconds before finally speaking. "A few weeks ago, during one of her appointments, I did some tests too. Nothing major. Just routine stuff. But the results came back, showing something they didn't like." Sandra's pulse quickened. "Keanu, what are you saying?" He met her gaze. "They found a spot. They're still running tests, but they think it might be serious." The world seemed to stop. Her hands went cold, the room shrinking around her. "No," she whispered. "I didn't want to tell you until I knew for sure," he said softly. "I didn't want to worry you or make it a headline somewhere. But when I said I needed to tell you something soon, that's what I meant. That, and what I just said about us. I couldn't leave either unsaid anymore." Tears welled in her eyes. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because," he said quietly, "you're one of the few people who see me, not the image, and I didn't want that to change. Not until I was ready to face it." She stepped forward, placing her hand on his chest, feeling his heartbeat steady beneath her palm. "You don't face this alone," she said firmly. "Not this time." His eyes glistened, but he didn't look away. "You've got enough light for both of us, don't you?" he said softly, with a faint smile that broke her heart even more. "Maybe," she whispered, her voice trembling. "And I'll share it until you find yours again." He looked at her for a long time, long enough that words became unnecessary. Then he whispered, "Thank you for always seeing me when I couldn't see myself." As he left that night, Sandra stood by the door long after his car disappeared. She felt everything all at once: fear, love, confusion, hope. For years, she had wondered if their connection was something unspoken or imagined. Now she knew. It was real. Painfully real. But the truth had arrived with something darker, something that threatened to take it all away before it even began. And as the night deepened, she whispered into the silence, "Don't fade, Keanu. Not now." Because she finally understood. This wasn't just a story of friendship. It was the story of two souls learning too late that they had always belonged in the same sentence. When the light started to fade, the next few weeks blurred into one long stretch of quiet days and restless nights. Sandra tried to stay strong, but every hour felt like it carried a question she couldn't answer. Keanu had started treatment, though he never spoke much about it. He said it wasn't about the illness. It was about keeping hope alive, one day at a time. They met often, usually at her house or in small, quiet cafes, far from the noise of cameras and curious faces. Every time she saw him, something inside her ached. He still smiled, still made small jokes, still carried that calm that had always defined him. But beneath it, she could see the exhaustion, the kind that didn't come from lack of sleep, but from fighting something invisible. One afternoon, she found him sitting on her porch, reading a book. The sun was gentle, the breeze soft. His hair moved slightly in the wind, and for a moment, he looked peaceful again. "You're early," she said as she walked out. He smiled faintly. "You said we'd watch that old movie at 4. It's 4:03. You're the only person I know who still shows up early to everything," she teased. "Maybe I just don't want to miss a moment that matters," he said, quietly. Something in the way he said it made her stop. There was no sadness in his voice, just truth. The kind of truth that made you realize how fragile time really was. They watched the movie together, the same one they had seen years ago when they were just co-stars trying not to admit how much they cared. Halfway through, she noticed his head had tilted slightly, his eyes closed. He wasn't asleep exactly, just resting. She muted the sound and sat there watching him breathe, memorizing every line of his face. A thought crossed her mind like a whisper she didn't want to hear. What if this was one of the last quiet days they'd share like this? She pushed the thought away and reached for his hand. His fingers were cold, but when she held them, they relaxed. His eyes opened slowly and he smiled at her. "Did I fall asleep?" he murmured. "Just for a minute," she said softly. "You didn't have to stay quiet for me." "Maybe I wanted to," she replied. "Maybe I like the sound of silence when you're here," he smiled, squeezing her hand. "That's the nicest thing anyone said to me today." Later that evening, they stepped outside. The sky was a canvas of pink and gold, and the smell of jasmine drifted through the garden. Sandra brought out 2 mugs of tea, handing him one. "So," she said, sitting beside him, "how are you really feeling today?" He thought for a moment before answering. A little tired, a little grateful, a little afraid. That's honest, she said. You said you liked honesty, he replied, his tone light but sincere. She looked at him, the fading sunlight touching his face. You're handling this better than anyone I know. I don't know about that, he said softly. I think I've just learned that pain doesn't always mean sadness. Sometimes it means awareness. Awareness? Yeah, he said, looking toward the horizon. Of what matters. Who matters? Of the things we ignore until they're almost gone. Her throat tightened. And what matters to you now? He turned to her, his eyes soft but certain. You, my sister. The quiet moments. The people who make me feel real. The words hit her like a wave, gentle but overwhelming. She wanted to reply, to tell him that he mattered more than he could ever imagine, but her voice refused to come out. Instead, she reached up and brushed his hair back from his forehead. He closed his eyes at her touch, exhaling slowly. For a long time, they sat there, the world reduced to the rhythm of their breathing. The following days became a pattern. She visited him at the clinic sometimes, bringing small things he liked. Books, old records, a pack of his favorite tea. He always pretended to be annoyed, saying she was spoiling him, but his eyes always softened the moment she walked in. One evening, as she entered his room, she found him sitting by the window, sketching something in a notebook. What are you drawing? She asked. He smiled faintly. Not drawing, writing. Can I see? Not yet, he said. But soon. He closed the notebook gently and looked up at her. You know what I realized? What? People think strength means not breaking. But sometimes strength is about allowing yourself to. She nodded, her eyes stinging. You've always been strong, Keanu. Only because people like you reminded me it's worth it, he said softly. She sat beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. For a moment, the beeping of machines, the scent of disinfectant, the weight of hospitals, all of it disappeared. There was only warmth and peace, and the quiet certainty that this connection had always meant more than either had dared to say. Weeks later, when he was strong enough to go out, they met at a park by the ocean. He said the sea helped him think. They walked slowly along the path, the sound of waves crashing softly in the distance. You ever wonder, he said, how some people enter your life quietly and end up becoming the reason you keep going? I do now, she said, smiling faintly. He laughed softly, then looked down at the ground. You know, when I told you about my feelings that night, I didn't expect you to say anything back. I just needed to say it out loud. But now that I have, it feels like something in me finally stopped running. You don't have to run anymore, she said. Not from this. Not from us. He stopped walking then, turning toward her. Us, he repeated quietly, as if testing the word. It feels strange saying it, like it's something we almost had but didn't know how to keep. Maybe we still can, she whispered. He smiled sadly. Maybe. Or maybe what we have right now is what it was always meant to be. Her heart sank at his tone. But before she could ask what he meant, he gently took her hand and pointed toward the horizon. Look, he said. The sun's setting, but it's beautiful, isn't it? Maybe that's what life is. Not about how long the light lasts, but about the beauty it leaves behind. She felt tears blur her vision. Don't talk like that. I'm not giving up, he said quickly. I'm just learning to make peace with every moment. He turned to her then, his hand brushing her cheek. Promise me something. Anything. No matter what happens, keep smiling. Not for me, but for everything we've shared. Because if I fade, I want to know that a part of me stays alive in your laughter. She couldn't answer. Her throat closed as tears slipped silently down her face. He wiped them away gently, his touch trembling but warm. Don't cry, Sandra, he said softly. You once told me laughter is survival. Remember? She nodded, trying to breathe through the ache. I remember. Then promise me you'll survive, he whispered. She nodded again, her voice barely audible. I promise. As the last light faded from the sky, they stood there, hand in hand, the waves whispering below them. And though neither spoke another word, both understood. Something unspoken had shifted. Love had finally found its voice between them, but somewhere deep inside her heart, Sandra knew the next chapter would test that love more than either of them was ready for, the promise that never faded. The sea breeze carried a quiet chill that morning, and the world felt slower, softer somehow. Sandra woke to the sound of her phone buzzing gently on the nightstand. For a second, her mind was blank. Then the thought hit her. She hadn't heard from Keanu in 2 days. She reached for the phone with trembling hands. A message blinked on the screen. It wasn't from him. It was from his sister's nurse. "He's asking for you." "He's at the clinic." Her heart stopped for a moment before it began to race again. She didn't even bother changing. She grabbed her keys, threw on a jacket, and drove through the morning mist, her mind echoing with every word they had ever shared. The clinic was quiet when she arrived. Too quiet. Nurses moved softly down the hallways, their faces gentle, their voices low. When she reached his room, she paused at the door. Her heart pounded so hard it felt like it was shaking her entire body. She took a deep breath and pushed the door open. Keanu was lying in bed, a faint smile on his face as he looked out the window. Sunlight streamed in through the blinds, falling across his face like gold. He looked fragile, but peaceful, as if the world outside couldn't touch him anymore. When he saw her, that familiar spark appeared in his eyes. "You came," he said softly. "You asked," she whispered, walking closer. "Of course I came." She sat beside him, taking his hand. It was warm, but weaker than before. Still, his fingers curled gently around hers. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her voice barely holding steady. "Like the sun's too bright," he said with a faint grin, "but I don't mind it. It feels like a good day." She smiled through her tears. "You've always loved the light." "Yeah," he said, "but I think I learned that from you." For a few minutes, neither spoke. The machines hummed quietly in the background, marking time in soft beeps. The scent of flowers filled the air. Someone had placed lilies by his window. Finally, he turned to her. "Do you remember that notebook I told you about? The one you were writing in?" He nodded. "It's in the drawer." "Can you get it?" She reached over, pulling out a small leather notebook. The edges were worn, the pages creased. He motioned for her to open it. Inside were pages filled with small handwriting, lines of thoughts, reflections, memories. And between them drawings, tiny sketches of moments from their lives. A coffee cup, a bus, a window view of rain. 2 silhouettes walking by the ocean. Her eyes filled with tears as she flipped through the pages. On one of the last pages, there was a simple sentence written across the center. "You were never just someone I worked with." "You were home?" She looked up at him, her voice breaking. "Keanu!" "Don't cry," he whispered. "I wrote that because I wanted you to remember, no matter where I am." She leaned forward, pressing her forehead gently against his. "You're not going anywhere," she whispered, her voice shaking. He smiled faintly. "Maybe not in the way you think." The room fell silent again, except for the rhythmic sound of his breathing. She held his hand tighter, as if her touch could keep him anchored. After a while, he said quietly, "I used to think life was about how long you live, but now I know it's about who makes it worth living." "You made it worth living," she said through her tears. "For me. For so many." "Then I've done enough," he said softly. His eyes began to close, but his fingers still brushed against hers. "Promise me something," he whispered. "Anything. Don't hide from the world when I'm gone. Keep doing what you do. Keep making people feel seen. And when you see the sunset, think of me there, somewhere in the light." She shook her head, tears streaming down. "Don't talk like that. It's not goodbye," he said gently. "It's just—" A pause between 2 scenes. His hand grew still. His breathing slowed. "Keanu?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Stay with me." But his eyes remained closed, a faint smile still resting on his face. The sunlight touched him like a blessing, and in that quiet moment, something inside her broke. And yet, somehow it also healed. Weeks later, Sandra stood by the ocean, the same place where they had last walked together. The sky blazed orange, the waves moving with quiet rhythm. She carried his notebook with her, the pages fluttering softly in the wind. She opened it to the last page, where he had left one more note. "If you're reading this, it means I found peace. Don't be sad, Sandy. Some people are meant to meet again in quieter places." She pressed the notebook against her heart, closing her eyes. For a long time, she just stood there, the wind brushing against her hair, the sound of the sea filling the silence. And then, softly, she smiled, because she realized something. Keanu hadn't left her. Not really. His kindness, his calm, his quiet strength, they were woven into her now. Every word he had spoken, every silence they had shared, lived inside her like sunlight. As the sun dipped below the horizon, she whispered, "You kept your promise. You're still here." The waves whispered back, carrying his memory into the distance. And for the first time in a long time, Sandra Bullock laughed through her tears because even though he was gone, the love he left behind would never fade. It had simply changed form, becoming light, becoming hope, becoming a quiet promise that would live with her for the rest of her days.